Walking a path along the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road to the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and how we can make this poem we're reading friendlier. One of them is suggesting some tactfully placed cat emoji. And that's me, Matthew Mellema. And welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Here at Believe to See, we explore the relationship between faith, art, and storytelling. Our goal is to help you connect the great story, the great stories, and our own stories in order to understand what it means to live with a Christian imagination. So, listeners, you may have heard me talk about Dana Gioia in the past. I really like him. He is a poet, literary critic, former business executive, and he wrote this essay in 1991 called Can Poetry Matter? Later got collected into a book of literary essays. I read it shortly after graduating from college and loved it. It's had a huge impact on the way I view poetry. And I want to read the beginning of the preface because I think it has a lot to do with the conversation we're about to have today. Here we go. I have read poetry as long as I have been able to read. Before that, my mother, a woman of no advanced education, read or recited it to me from memory. Consequently, I have never considered poetry an intrinsically difficult art whose mysteries can be appreciated only by a trained intellectual elite. Poetry is an art, like painting or jazz, opera or drama, whose pleasures are generally open to any intelligent person with the inclination to savor them. Critics, justly obsessed with the difficulty of interpreting poetical texts, often forget the sheer immediacy of the medium's appeal. Study may deepen and training refine one's taste for poetry, but the appetite itself is not an especially sophisticated thing. I have found that a very formative idea for me in poetry, just thinking of poetry as something that people should like. There, that's the end of the statement. And I believe our guest today will have some thoughts along those lines as well. Our guest is poet Jody Collins. She has a new poetry collection that is newly out called Mining the Bright Birds, Poems of Longing for Home. And she has a lot of thoughts on poetry and a concept she calls making friends with poetry. Jody, welcome to the Digital Pub Table.
Oh, thank you, Matt. Happy to be here. Yes.
All right. And we are happy to have you here. So let's talk a little bit about this immediate collection of poetry. Tell us about Mining the Bright Birds. If there was like a through line on what these poems are about, what would it be?
Well, they all were spawned by just sitting outside in nature and just looking out my window and combining all of the things I saw in creation, as well as a few things from the mundane parts of my day, but mostly how creation speaks to us. And the birds have lots and lots to say. The title poem is taken from sitting outside under the deck on a freezing cold day, and I saw a hummingbird far away on a branch and thought about how she was, like a gem in a gold mine. And so Mining the Bright Birds came from that. So there's other poems on there about little, things that are a little deeper, but mostly inspired by creation and, God's beauty.
Yeah. Tell us about the subtitle of the collection, Poems of Longing for Home. How does that play into it?
Well, that's a great question. It's funny, when I sent this book off to an editor before I submitted it for a manuscript, oftentimes when you sit down with your work, at least this is the way I work. This is my second book of poetry. You have piles of things that you think kind of go together, and then you hand it off to someone and say, see what you can make of this. And she came back to me after a few weeks and said she had 6 or 7 different themes that she saw running through the work, which I couldn't see because I was too close to it. And she said, stepping outside of it, I see several different things here, like a homing pigeon or pilgrimage or something like welcome, trying to be found. I mean, she said several different things and gave me some, possible titles. And one of them was Jody. Woven throughout these is I just see kind of this journey that kind of goes through the seasons, but also is a way of watching your own particular journey of going towards home. It could be, and in my mind, of course, home is heaven where Jesus is, but also my understanding of becoming a poet, because I didn't really buy into the fact that I was a poet until, I don't know, 2018 or so, and had to kind of own it. I've been writing for a very long time, but put the poet hat on for reals at that time. So, yeah.
And I'm glad you ended at that point, because that's what I wanted to ask you next. It's tell us about your journey as a poet. It sounds like you did other writing, then sort of came to poetry later. Tell us how that happened.
Well, it's funny. I became a Christian in 1973, 1,000 years ago, and found Lucy Shaw's work at the time. And I thought, oh my gosh, there's like Christian people that write poetry. But I had written tons of bad poetry when I was, I don't know, 15, 16, 17, as all teenagers do, and then I got married and had kids and went to school and did all this stuff and didn't think much more about it. And then I started writing online. I've had essays published in papers and all kinds of things, and came to, I think it was 2018, as I said. I had been writing on my blog, but hadn't really considered poetry until I heard Lucy in person and met her in 2018 at the Festival of Faith and Writing. And at that time, she just turned 92, so she's been around for a while. At the time, she was incredibly encouraging, and she said, and I had brought the book of poetry that I had of hers that was like 50 years old, and asked her to sign it. And she said, excuse me, she said, go back home, start writing, you can do it. So I owned it and started doing that. So, yeah.
That is amazing. So I know something that I feel, because, I generally write, prose fiction, and I've written a poem or two, but it's not something I've really pursued at any length. I know for me, I feel like I have this mental block of writing poetry where I never felt this way writing prose, but for poetry, it's like, ooh, I feel like I need some advanced training for that, and I'm guessing a lot of writers feel that way. Was that something that you felt was like, I need to take a test so I know what an enjambment means and what's iambic versus trochee and all this stuff?
Right. And what's majesticulation? I know Malcolm Guite was the first person that I read as a poet, pardon me, in 2012. So 12 years ago. But he writes sonnets, and I'm like, I can't do sonnets. But then I started meeting other poets and going to conferences. I just sort of kept reading and listening and learning from people whose work I liked. Tanya Runyon and Laurie Klein and Susan Cowger and Benjamin Myers and Brett Foster, different authors. Scott Cairns, who lives here in the area where I live in Seattle.
Scott Cairns is one of my favorite poets.
Yes, and he's a friend. And I'm sort of outgoing. So I would just show up at these poetry readings or these conferences and go up and say, hi, I'm Jody, and, get them to sign my work. But they were just all kind and welcoming and said, I'm so glad you're here and thank you for asking about my poetry. So I mean, my degree is in early childhood development. I taught school till I was, for 8th grade, elementary through 8th grade. I did not get an English degree. So I always joke about how I stole from the best people because I couldn't afford the education I needed to do so. So I just read a lot and hung out and listened to people and learned from some of the best people. Yeah.
Yeah, and to that point, in that preface to Can Poetry Matter that I read, Dana Gioia opened with him basically saying, hey, my mom, didn't have formal education. She always taught me poems, so I never thought of poems as sort of this fancy thing that only fancy people can enjoy. Was that your view of it too in your like pre-poet days, or did you kind of feel that there's this distance between you and poetry?
Well, here's how I'm going to say that. When I tell people I write poetry, they shrug their shoulders and go, what? Because in my head, it was like, it all has to rhyme. So that was the first thing, is I had to figure out, there's free verse and then there's rhyming. I think for me, I didn't feel that I needed education so much as I just needed an understanding, like, there's like this top secret society really somewhere, and they all know what makes it really cool, but and maybe if I can infiltrate the secret society, I'll get the words. So, as I said, I learned from going to conferences. So I think I felt distanced perhaps by, the knowledge or the education piece. But it all depends on what you grow up with, to Dana's point. And I mean, like Malcolm Guite, he heard his mother recite poetry to him when he was like 5 years old, and he just grew up that way. So it depends on what you've grown up with. But I guess I had to learn a little bit. But I'm up to learning, so yeah.
Was there like a first poem that really like grabbed you and like, oh, this is amazing?
Yes, something by Lucy Shaw, I'm sure, which if I can reach far enough, I could grab here on my desk. Yeah, because she was writing in the 70s, she was writing a lot about just approaching faith in, just a really realistic way. So I think Lucy Shaw, and I don't have poems committed to memory, so I would have to, as I said, grab my file. So, and that was in the beginning, but then Malcolm's work, The Singing Bowl. I don't know if you're familiar with Malcolm Guite or his poem, The Singing Bowl.
Oh, he is an Anselm Society favorite. Don't worry. We love Malcolm Guite around here.
He is. And I had a chance to learn from him at the Glen workshop several years ago. So begin the song exactly where you are. The Singing Bowl is one of the only two poems I've memorized. So I think that in his collection of After Prayer, or in The Singing Bowl as well, just it never ceases to speak to me. It just, and his poems are so fun to memorize because, of the rhyme and the rhythm to them. So, yeah.
Yeah, that is great to hear. And I will say, I think there is something about just telling poems to young children where I think we oftentimes think like, oh, kids can't handle poetry, but it seems like, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, it's actually really good for them. I had this really interesting experience just a little bit ago where a couple months ago, I was having lunch with my 5-year-old and it's just the two of us for some reason. So I was like, hey buddy, you want me to like read something to you? So I go over to the bookshelf and I don't know why I picked out Beowulf, the Seamus Heaney translation. And he loved it. Like I'd be reading about like all the kings of old and their golden halls. Like, is that enough? But he's like, nah, keep going. We just recently made it to the part where Beowulf finally kills Grendel, and he was in. It's like, I don't know what it is. I think that's a lot more common among young children than we would believe.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure it's a content of Beowulf. Again, Seamus Heaney's is the one I need to read if and when I get to read it. My
5-year-old would highly recommend it.
Isn't that something? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's go to this topic you mentioned a lot in your other writing. It's about making friends with poetry. So I think it's a fascinating concept. So tell us sort of broad strokes what you mean by making friends with poetry.
Well, first of all, I hope this isn't an overgeneralization, but in some circles, people might think, are there Christians that write poetry? You know what I'm saying? Even the concept of imagination is kind of suspect. So I have to explain that yes, God can use poetry, and there are lots of Christian poets that do so, but to just not be afraid of it. And I think one of the things that puts people off is, as I said, I think it's a mysterious kind of subject, and they want to get it right. They don't understand. They don't have the language to say why they don't like something. I think that giving people language around what it is they like about a poem, is it the sound? Is it the images? Is it the emotions that it elicits in them? Just giving them some tools to explain how to read a poem and how to write a poem. Because there are two sides. One is, how to read a poem, what to look for, what to listen for, or how to write it, which is even scarier.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that's a great sort of overview of the issue that you just laid out there. So let's start with sort of the core problem, it seems. Like this conception among just like people, like people you meet on the street, that poems are something scary and intimidating that you need special knowledge for. Why do you think that became the case? Because that, for most of human history, that was not the case, but it is now, apparently.
Well, of course, it reminds me of the Billy Collins poem about, tying a poem to a chair and beating it to death to see what it means. I went to school, and that was my experience, is let's analyze the heck out of this poem, which is just, infuriating. And honestly, poetry isn't taught much in school anymore. It just isn't, I have grandchildren. My children are in their 40s, and they were probably the last generation of kids that it was part of the curriculum. Now it's Poetry Week, and I'm like, why does it have to just be 1 week? So I think, like many of the things that are taught, in my experiences, I taught public and private school, it is not thought to be that important, I guess. But again, people feel like, and I don't think that they can say how or why a poem, speaks to them, and, does it elicit an emotion or an image of some kind. So I'm rambling here. I'm sorry, I'm not answering your question very well, but anyway.
No, I think that brings some important points to the issue, and I think that your experience of seeing what like your grandkids are doing is very interesting, because it seems like there's this academization of poetry that happens at several levels. There's the level at the university and graduate level where it's fancy talk at seminar rooms. It's people showing off how smart they are by getting all these arcane meanings out of the text. I've done that. I've been in those seminar rooms. It can be really fun, especially when you find something that people are like, oh, that's clever. But I'm not sure it's the sort of thing that would appeal to most people beyond a specific type of nerd, right? So that's one thing where it's an advanced academic discipline at the college level.
Right.
Then at the high school and lower, so like middle school, I get the feeling that a lot of folks will study poetry, but they study it to learn to check specific boxes. So it's like, here's a poem we read to learn about meter. Here's one to learn about rhyme scheme. Here's one to learn about enjambment. Here's one to learn about iambic versus trochee. Right. Yeah, so it's like that is good stuff, and it helps you analyze it, but you learn that stuff so that you can better enjoy the poem. It's not an end to itself, and I worry that a lot of times we make the means the end. Just like, okay, I read this poem by John Donne to learn about metaphor. And it's not like, isn't John Donne amazing? It's like, that's what a metaphor is. Moving on.
Correct. One of the poems I wrote is, that's never been published, is The Week That the Reading Experts Came to School. For all of those many reasons, which is why when I learned to teach, whole languages was a thing, because we used literature in order to teach, and then it became this dissection kind of literature. So, yeah, I think a poem becomes alive when it's read aloud, right? That's what Malcolm says, and if people can hear it read enough, I think that's one way to excite them about it. And to just love the way a poem sounds, just love a poem because of the way it sounds.
Yeah.
Just making it part of what you do. So.
Yeah, I totally agree. And you mentioned that Billy Collins poem, which is one of my favorites, where he talks about beating the poem with like rubber hoses to get it to give it secrets. Another line of that poem is he wants to just water ski along the meaning of the poem, right? He doesn't want to dig deep. He doesn't want to get all profound. Just water ski, have fun. Let the words wash over you. There's a lot of value in that. I was talking to a friend of Anselm, Terry Moon, and she's a violinist. She plays in Colorado Springs Symphony. She's super, super good. And I was sort of confessing to her on the podcast. It's like, for classical music, I was never much of a musician. I'm kind of tone deaf. So I kind of feel like I don't know what I'm supposed to do, right? And what she told me is, well, Matt, if music's doing its job, you'll feel how you're supposed to feel about it, right? So if music's trying to make you feel happy, the music will make you feel happy or sad or contemplative. I think poems are a lot of that way too. It's like, no, read the words, listen to the words being spoken. How does that make you feel? Let's talk about that.
Exactly. And a lot of times people, well, what makes a poem a good poem? I mean, I have completely subjective, my own list of 4 things that makes a good poem. But does it elicit an emotion or an image? I mean, because it's going to be one of those 2 things. Do you feel something when you hear this, or do you see something? Is the poet conjuring up, pictures of a fireside chat somewhere around Christmas time, or are you remembering bright fireworks? Are you thinking about fireflies or something? Or are they like, they're describing something that's very, very sad and deep for you. And you're like, oh, that gets me. So understanding if that's what makes a poem good. It's not some mystery. It's like, how do you feel when you read it? Or what do you see? Those 2 things, images or, emotions, just knowing that, because it can be unlocked. Those mysteries can be unlocked.
Yeah, absolutely. And to that point, you mentioned you have some sort of criteria that you have when you're looking at a poem. What are the things that poets or writers can do, or what should we be looking for in poems to know whether they'll be accessible to folks who may not have as much experience with poetry?
Great question. So 4 things. If you are reading something or listening to something, it should make a connection with you in some way where the language or the words resonate and touch you in some way. So it prompts a response that says, wow, I see that, or I feel that, or I think that too. Or those words perfectly describe what it was like at my mother's funeral, or the way I felt looking at the Grand Canyon, or at the birth of my first child. And to me, a good poem ultimately points to God. It opens up a window some way for people to see God, either through the language that's extremely creative, and you're like, oh my word, that person is so creative, what a gift God's given them, or the words themselves offer you a way to look up in hope, even if it's about death or cancer or suicide or something. There's, the poet's giving you a way to look up. Both of those, to me, are what makes a good poem. And of course, I'm a Christian, so that's what I think. I think a lot of times poetry poetry is a form. It's not a genre. That's one of the big problems people think. It's prose and poetry. Poetry is a form. It's written in verse. And one of the things about it, when people are looking at, what they think is poetry, is just, it's a self-help session, or a therapy session, or a rant or a rave or something in chopped up sentences. And then they call it a poem. So I have feelings about that. I think people need to be very, very careful about what a good poem really is, and there's a lot of technical stuff. I've done some videos and workshops about, how to end a line and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, those are my 4 criteria.
Great. So I'm really interested by the distinction you made about, poem being like in verse. So how do you define being in verse?
Well, great question. So Scott Cairns, whose essay In a Syllable of Water is about something mirror. The word mirror is in it. Scott's the first person I heard talk about the fact that poetry is a form. And it's written in verses coming from the word versa, which means turn. So, you come to the end of a line and you turn. Your eyes should follow to the next line. The reader should want to turn. So prose is just sentences that go to the end of the page, and then they go back to the beginning, and they fill the whole page, whether you're done with a thought or not. Whereas in poetry, a poet is specifically choosing where to end a line based on, hopefully, language that's going to pull you along to read it. So does that make sense?
No, that does make sense. So So follow-up question there, and I'm sorry, I might be getting a little nerdy. Like I like those, so I do like the seminar tables too. But
Sure.
so you talked about the unit of the line. Now,
Yes.
to me, I think of that mostly as written on the page. How would that then apply to a poem that's meant to be spoken out loud?
Well, you know what? There is performance poetry, which is a whole nother thing, which I probably can't speak to, which is a play on words. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know, Matt. Yeah. I mean, I think all poetry should be read out loud, but there is, people who do performance poetry, and I have never done that. So, but if you're writing poetry, it's in verse.
Gotcha. All right. So let's talk about what you prefer then, because I'll talk to different poets. Jane Charla, a friend of the show, she writes mainly in more formal verses, whereas other poets prefer the more free verse. Do you have a camp, and do you feel strongly about a camp, or do you like them both?
I like them both. And by the way, I bought Jane's book because of your interview with her and Pons. Well, of course, I saw it when I was at the C.S. Lewis Writers Conference. Mm-hmm. So I've been working on that. And she's a very smart poet and very educated like that. I tend to write almost all free verse. Rhyme and meter does not come natural to me. But as a teacher, I know that it is a fabulous tool for memorization. Mm-hmm. And of course, the 3 poems that I've memorized are all rhyming poets. So what do I like to... I prefer to write in free verse. I read a lot of classical poets, Herbert and Hopkins and John Donne, which of course all rhyme, sonnets mostly. So, did I answer your question? It depends on whether I'm reading or writing, I guess, is my answer.
So it sounds like you really enjoy reading formal, but you tend to go toward the free verse when you're writing.
Correct. I have probably, in Minding the Bright Birds, my newest book, I probably have 2 poems that rhyme. And in my first book, Hearts on Pilgrimage, I had a couple of rhyming poems. In fact, I have a very funny poem called, that I wrote for my grandchildren. That, Nana, your poems don't rhyme. So, so I wrote them a rhyming poem.
I love that. So I will say, just for me personally, when like I said, I've written a few poems. It's not really it's not my main thing. I love reading poetry though, and I've tended to gravitate more toward the formal poetry. And I know for me, especially when I'm writing poetry, I feel like there's a certain amount, it's like guardrails for me having like, okay, I need this meter, I need this rhyme scheme. Whereas having free verse seems like, oh man, there's too much freedom. There's too much freedom. I need a fence. I need a wall. Do you struggle with that sort of feeling with your free verse, and how do you overcome it?
Matt, that is an excellent point. I've only written 2 sonnets in my life, and they were very difficult. But because of the form, I was so grateful. Because yes, there is a formula. And it was kind of freeing. Now, in free verse or blank verse, whatever you want to call it, there's you look visually like Lori Klein. She and Susan Calgary founded Rock and Sling Press, and Lori Klein they're both still writing. Anyway, Lori Klein told me once something about how does a poem look visually, the lines. This is a personal preference. Not all poetry is like this. What's the length of the lines like? Do you have language, as I said, that your endings are going to, cause a reader to go to the next line. So I have to pay attention to. I use way too many gerunds. You can't end a sentence with there's a word for a preposition. And I repeat myself all the time. So I think in free verse, but it's work to revise all the time. So, yeah.
I love what you said about gerunds. Just recently, I'm going through the manuscript for my middle grade novels coming out later this summer. So I've been going through the editor. It's been super fun. As I was going through it, I realized just by doing a word search, like it's a 50,000 word, middle grade book.
Right.
I used the word crisscross 8 times. And I was like, that is too many times. And I had no idea, I had this fondness for the term crisscross, but apparently I did. So I decided to cut out 7 of them.
Right.
So
or
these things you learn about your writing once you're actually doing it.
Right. Or grab a thesaurus, right?
Exactly. So unfortunately, we're running low on time. But really quick kind of lightning round question. Let's assume a listener here, they enjoy reading, but maybe they haven't gotten too deep into poetry yet, and they're trying to find some friendly entry points. Are there any particular poets you'd recommend for the educated reader who is more new to the poetry scene?
Gee whiz. I'm putting together a list on my Substack called Poetry and Many Things of female faith poets. Abigail Carroll. She has 3 books: Letters to St. Francis, A Gathering of Larks. Abigail Carroll is just a favorite. Lori Klein, Tanya Runyon. These are all contemporary poets. They all write free verse. None of them write rhyme or meter. Lucy Shaw, of course.
Mm-hmm. Ooh, can I add one? She's an older author, but she's a female poet of faith. Christina Rossetti is one of my favorites. So
right.
she writes in the more formal things, and that's an older one. But
right, I've got my classical list as well: Christina Rossetti, Sarah Teasdale, and then Anne Porter, 20th century Catholic writer. Yeah, way too many. There's way too many to name.
Which is a good problem to have. Too many friendly poets to name. I like that. All right. Awesome. Well, like I said, we are running out of time, so we're going to have to go here. But before we do, once again, listeners, her name is Jody Collins. Jody is spelled Jody. Collins, like the normal Collins. The name of the poetry collection is Mining the Bright Birds, Poems of Longing for Home. Please check it out. And again, thank you so much, Jody, for joining us. Where can we find you? Where can we find your writing? Where can we find your poetry?
Oh, thank you for asking. Well, you can look at my website, which is jodyleecollins.com, Jody with a Y, Lee, Collins.com. And there is an archive of blog posts on there, but there's also a tab that goes straight to my Substack. And if people go to my Substack and subscribe there, they get a free thing called 5 Things That Might Surprise You About Poetry. But there's a lot of resources on there. I have a poetry resource tab on my Substack mentioning all these things. I'm not on social media anymore, but you can reach me via the contact on my page on my website. And and my books are on Amazon. I have 2 poetry books on Amazon and an ebook for Christmas also on Amazon. So that's where I am. Thank you for asking.
Absolutely. Thank you again for joining us. And listeners, as you can probably tell, things are winding down at the Anselm Society Digital Pub. The fire is down to embers, the customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. If you have about, say, 30 seconds or so right now that you can spare, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Bonus points if the review is in verse. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.